From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. In many ways, it looked like any other global summit. A huge red carpet flanked by giant flags, world leaders striding in, all smiles for the cameras, glad-handing each other. But look a little closer at China's big summit, and it's a curious scene. There's Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, one arm around Putin while warmly clasping the hand of the Chinese Premier, Xi Jinping, and chuckling at a joke, despite the fact that their armies are still training guns at each other at their shared border. The host, Xi Jinping, created a ripple by criticising bullying countries, clearly a swipe at America. But he also set out his vision, shared by many of the countries attending, including Russia, Iran, Belarus, and more than a dozen others, to rewrite the global order.
We should advocate an equal and orderly multipolar world and a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization, and make the global governance system more just and equitable.
They talked about a new global security and economic order, new financial systems, a new international bank. They even unveiled a new anthem. The song is called The Light in Our Eyes, which might have something to do with a shared vision or their collective fervour. Or maybe it's just a warning about a driving hazard, but more than 20 world leaders watched on and applauded as it was unveiled at the grand state banquet for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization 2025 as the song of the summit, and maybe the anthem for the new alliances being forged. With an enormous military parade still to go tomorrow, is this the week that will establish Xi Jinping as the leader of the not-so-free world? Is this a bloc that could genuinely rival NATO and the West? And how worried should we be about it? The story today: President Xi's New World Order.
So I'm Richard Spencer. I'm the China correspondent of The Times, and I'm currently in Beijing, where I'm looking forward to the enormous military parade that's going to take place later this week to commemorate the end of the Second World War.
Are you already seeing preparations taking place?
They're quite subdued at the moment. They've had the big rehearsals for this massive parade. They held them on a series of nights in the last couple of weeks, which did give rise to great images. They didn't mind people taking photographs, so there's been lots of pictures of tanks and marching bands and massed military forces marching through the centre of Beijing in the darkness. Quite sinister in some ways, but also quite striking.
And Richard, we're expecting a huge gathering of world leaders for both the parade and a big meeting that's already taking place before it. Just talk us through the cast of characters. Who's coming?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. I mean, it's a large cast. I wouldn't say it was huge, actually. They'd be quite disappointed with some of the non-attenders to the parade. To take it in order, there are two events happening this week, one of which is on Monday, which is the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which you may or may not have heard of before. It's a group of sort of Eurasian states. It includes China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Central Asian countries. It's often termed the anti-NATO, which it really balks at because, when it was first set up, it was very much set up by Russia and China to counter what they saw as the American domination of the world order, if you like. But they point out that it has no armies, it has no military HQ like NATO. It does discuss security issues and occasionally does joint exercises, but there's certainly no military alliance. And indeed, in some cases like India, that would be very unlikely, given that India is probably more likely to go to war with Pakistan and China than any other countries in the world, and they're both fellow members. But it's a talking shop, at least for countries that either are non-aligned geopolitically or actively seeking to change the global order to give greater representation to countries outside the West. So you've got the members of that organization, which include China, Russia, as I say, India. You've got Belarus as well. You've got the Central Asian states and quite a lot of observer states as well. For example, Turkey, President Erdogan has shown up. So this SCO with China, its dominant player, certainly, is stressing that, it may be less ambitious than NATO in terms of going into countries and sorting out their problems for them, like NATO tried to do in Afghanistan. It's also more consistent in what it tries to achieve and what it says and does. So that's one cast list. But then we come on to the parade, and obviously a lot of the leaders will go onto the parade, most notably President Putin. He'll have pride of place in the parade next to China. But there's a different cast list for that. Prime Minister Modi of India won't be going to the parade. But you do have Kim Jong-un turning up. Kim Jong-un is very keen currently on the sort of tripartite relationship with Putin and Xi, which you've seen, for example, in the Ukraine war, where North Korean soldiers have fought and died.
Yeah.
So he's going to arrive by train. He's apparently setting off around now from North Korea by train and will arrive tomorrow. So they will have pride of place in the parade. But you'll also see one or two other interesting figures. You'll see President Fico of Slovakia, who's the only EU member to have accepted an invitation to the parade. That's raised a few eyebrows.
That'll be quite awkward at the next EU meeting.
Yeah, he's quite pro-Putin and is one of these sort of new populists that are being elected in the EU. So that's why he's gone. But you won't see President Trump, for example, who is popularly supposed to have been invited, but clearly thought that standing on a podium alongside Putin, Xi and Kim Jong-un would be a step too far. And other European leaders won't be going, mainly because of Putin's presence.
So no Donald Trump. Lots of leaders from Central Asia, from the Global South, and surprisingly, even a couple of Europeans popping up there. This is supposed to be a military parade to mark the anniversary of the end of the Second World War for China. It does sort of double up as sort of a more modern statement on where they are militarily too, I suppose. I mean, what are you expecting to see at this parade?
I mean, I expected some of this, but it's very strong, the sense of this parade as a military showpiece. It's clear from these rehearsals that China is really using it as an opportunity to show off its new military hardware, including things that, people have been wanting to get a look at, like submarine missiles, laser technology, new tanks, which have been, according to military experts, are clearly designed learning from the experience of Russian tanks in the Ukrainian war, where the principles of tank warfare have changed completely because of the mass use of drones. We're going to see apparently China's new stealth aircraft, the J-20, which has only appeared once briefly at an air show last year. So you're really seeing a display of China's military strength. It's not clear quite what the purpose is of that. There have been lots of warnings that Xi is preparing the People's Liberation Army to attack Taiwan. There was a well-reported target by Xi that the PLA should be ready to take Taiwan technically by 2027. But apparently Xi has also given private undertakings to America that he won't actually do that. And there's certainly little sign of a build-up to that. So maybe it's saying to America and anyone else watching, look, we may not be going to invade Taiwan, but we are capable of doing that. So don't get any ideas, Taiwan, about declaring independence or crossing our red lines. And America, please note that our military build-up is completely serious and we're not stopping whatever you say. And there's a second message, which is also very important, which is all about the public relations and propaganda around the purpose of the parade, this anniversary.
Yeah.
In the past, military parades were really for the anniversary of the so-called liberation of China, which was the victory of the Communist Party in the Civil War in 1949. So you saw parades in 2009 and 2019. There was a parade in 2015 for the 70th anniversary, but this is like nothing we've seen before. And I think it's partly in a way to reclaim China's role in the Second World War. I mean, it's always been a very painful topic. The Second World War for China means invasion by Japan. I mean, that was preceded what we call the Second World War. Japan's incursion started in 1931 and the full-blown invasion started in 1937. And it was horrific for China. I mean, Japan took all of China's main East Coast cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Hong Kong, and from the British, obviously, then, and inflicted real horrors on China. And 20 million Chinese died as a direct or indirect consequence of that war. A horrific toll. And China's always felt very humiliated by it. And it's also a political problem in some ways because the government of China, which held out very bravely and fought very bravely a rearguard action, was, of course, the Chinese Nationalist Party then, the Kuomintang, which was the party that the Communist Party defeated in the Civil War. So there's always a bit of an embarrassment about sort of claiming that war and the eventual defeat of Japan as a Chinese victory, if you like. But she is now very much focused on China as a national power, as a historic power, and this idea of China and Russia as having been the countries that mainly suffered is their joint message. And it's quite a powerful one when you see them saying, look at Western Europe, look at Japan now, as they say, trying to rewrite the war, trying to, forget the role of Japan in the war, downplay some of the horrors. And you saw Putin at the weekend in an interview with Xinhua, the state news agency, attacking German rearmament and remilitarization, saying we know nothing from the Nazi past. I mean, it's quite aggressive stuff that's coming out of both of these powers. But that's sending a modern day message that Russia and China are the upholders of, righteous politics against these sort of former Nazis and fascists who are now in alliance with America. We find that kind of messaging fairly distasteful, but in some ways with Japan, we share a little bit of the sentiment, of course, because we also think that Japan hasn't apologized enough for the war. But when you cast that onto the modern world stage, with things like the invasion of Ukraine, with China's, threat to Taiwan and aggression in the Western Pacific, as we see it, we read that in a slightly different way.
That's so interesting. So they're trying to reclaim the narrative, the historic narrative of what happened at the end of the Second World War. And Richard, we know that Kim Jong-un is still on his train on the way over. Putin is there already. This is sort of the Putin and Xi show at the moment. What is he saying publicly? We know there are nuances between the narrative, but how is he using this opportunity?
So Putin is using this much more aggressively in an anti-American way to say, you can take me on, but can you take me and China on? He is under economic pressure, Putin, so he's also trying to sort of love bomb Xi, I think, into ensuring that China keeps purchasing Russian oil, keeps the Russian economy going, lends it diplomatic support. Putin will be here for 4 days. That's a very long trip abroad by Putin's standards. So he's really pressing the idea that this is an alliance in the face of America. China uses the same talking points, but puts it rather more gently. China is more concerned to keep relations with America and Europe smooth because there are still serious talks to be had with America over tariffs and Europe over tariffs and trade policy more generally. So there's a difference in tone, even if some of the underlying messaging is the same. But for Putin, this is quite important to show his people, if nothing else, that, Russia isn't isolated and the growing power is on Russia's side, even if the fading power, as they would like to see it, is against it.
And Richard, you're in Beijing. How is this going down with the Chinese? Do they see this as a marker in China as the growing power?
I think so, yes. I mean, it's always very hard to gauge Chinese public opinion, partly because it's so big. And I always try and kick back against the idea that, you can say that China as a whole thinks one thing when there are 1.4 billion of them. Certainly, there's a lot of excitement about the parade. A lot of people want to see it. It's a big event. Things have been pretty economically depressed, particularly in Beijing in the last couple of years. So there is a sense of a bit of a national fillip when things aren't going well. I mean, of course, there are also cynics and critics who are saying, why are we doing this when actually China needs the West, needs investment? Why are we trying to deter investment and solidarity with the West, and why are we spending so much money on all this stuff? But those are views being expressed privately, not in public. The official view is full steam ahead for the China economic and geopolitical miracle, the renovation, the renewal of China's greatness, and the end to centuries of humiliation, as all these things are in terms of Chinese propaganda. But I think there's a bit of genuine excitement about the parade. I mean, it's just going to be quite a lot of fun to look at, I think. These things can be quite spectacular if you don't find them scary.
We've heard how Xi Jinping is welcoming not just Putin and Kim Jong-un, but a ragtag collection of world leaders to China this week. But if you're in the West, if you're in Downing Street or the White House, and you're watching these images of India's Prime Minister schmoozing with what's now being known as the axis of upheaval, days before a huge military parade in the streets of Beijing, what should you be thinking? How would you react?
Well, I think the Europeans will be looking at this very warily. I don't quite know how the White House will be looking at it.
Catherine Philp is the Times World Affairs editor.
But some of the issues going on there, especially the presence of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is really as a result of some of the pushing away of India that Washington has done recently and pushed it towards Russia and China. So in terms of what they think of what they've done, I don't know. But I think that their culpability in this over the last few months and this isolation between India and the US, pushing it towards China, is going to be a very interesting dynamic coming forward. And I know that it makes the Europeans nervous.
And Catherine, you talked about India and how the relationship with President Trump seems to have directly pushed them further into China's orbit. I mean, just tell us how that process has come about. I mean, rumour has it that Modi isn't even answering Donald Trump's calls at the moment.
That's correct. Since June, when there was a kind of conflagration of tensions resulting in military action between India and Pakistan, Trump weighed into it and said that he was solely responsible for stopping it in its tracks and stopping it going nuclear. And he's chalked it up as one of his peace deal successes. Pakistan promptly, sensing an opportunity, nominated him for the Nobel Prize. And India was furious because India's narrative was that it had seen off Pakistan, its smaller neighbour, with its own military prowess, its own military action. And here was Trump taking the credit for having stopped this. I mean, furthermore, it's simply not in Modi's playbook to have Trump solve his problems or have external forces get into what India sees as an internal matter or a matter with its neighbours over Kashmir. And then secondly, and really bizarrely, Trump, as usual, used sort of threats and lures about trade and credited those with stopping the hot phase of the war. And then he said that he was going to put these secondary sanctions on countries that bought Russian oil over the issue of Ukraine. Well, he didn't do that. What he did do was, in the middle of trade talks with India, he slapped some tariffs on to try and pressure them. And then he slapped some additional tariffs on over the Russian oil. Now, the fact that he didn't do that to anyone else who buys Russian oil, such as China, made it really very clear that this was about India. It wasn't about Ukraine or Russia at all. So that was another slap from Trump that was more than Modi could take. So essentially, Modi has this difficulty in this narrative at home that he cannot be seen to be doing Trump's bidding or for America to be bossing India around. It runs counter to his pitch of India as an important player on the global stage. And so ever since then, the conversations between Trump and Modi, who were once great chums, that's gone silent. They're not speaking to each other. And meanwhile, Modi is being very visibly courted by Putin and Xi.
And this is interesting to us, I suppose, because it does feel like this might be a major blunder in foreign policy terms by President Trump if he's managed to push Modi into the arms of the Chinese leader.
Yes, to me, it's extraordinary. Now, I mean, there are lots of reasons to be anxious about India or skeptical about India, but this doesn't really seem to be the right territory. You know, India is quite protectionist in trade. That's an issue. Human rights issues at home aren't great. So there's been some domestic criticism in the West about dealing with them. But nonetheless, they're not China. And they have long been seen, pretty much the last 20 years, as an excellent bulwark against Chinese dominance of Asia, and that they were going to be sort of used in this way. And in fact, India is part of something called the Quad, which is a kind of loose sub-NATO strategic alliance in that area with the US and Australia, India and Japan. So you have to wonder what the future of that kind of cooperation is when India had sort of turned in that way strategically towards the West against China, because China's great partner in the region is Pakistan. So that suited them. They've been, of late, buying far more American kit than they did previously. They were mostly buying Russian. So it remains to be seen. So will India still want to buy American weaponry when it's being treated like this? Will that go down okay at home in the world's largest democracy? And will it start buying Chinese weapons? I mean, these are all new issues as of 3 months ago.
And they're literally sitting down with China and Pakistan, two countries they've recently been at war with.
Exactly, yes.
Catherine, people are looking at this as a moment that is sort of reshaping the global order. It's changing the way the world operates. Part of that is financial institutions. You know, that's one of the things that for the past century has been quite constant. Talk us through the sort of infrastructure changes that this group seems to be looking at.
It's really a process by which the world is falling out of that pattern of America controlling all the institutions, you know, be they the global institutions of world order or even financial ones. So obviously the dominance of the dollar as the reserve currency, there are moves towards finding an alternative to that, which would expose less of the world's economy to American sanctions if they were put on them. A lot of dollar trading is very easy to sanction, and therefore if you had another reserve currency, you would avoid that. The same is also true of SWIFT, the international payment system, which was suspended to Russia over the Ukraine war. Again, it's a tool that gives the Americans more control over global financial infrastructure than a lot of these countries are comfortable with. So they would like to see other ways to do it.
And Catherine, in terms of America's power diminishing, it's partly the fear of what might happen with the financial institutions. There's also sort of the moral institutions that have ruled the world. And I mean, it's been really odd watching the comments coming out of the meeting so far, where President Xi seems to be making a stronger case for the UN than any Western leader does these days. I mean, it's a very weird moment.
It is, and I noticed exactly the same kind of rhetoric that you were talking about, that where Xi sounded more like that kind of, you know, old school American president or world leader talking about upholding the world order. And I think it's part of a kind of project that China's been engaged in maybe the last decade or more, where essentially, rather than smashing down the global order in the way that Trump appears to want to do, things like sanctioning the ICC and withdrawing from various UN institutions and generally being hostile to that, China is really actually more interested in spreading its influence and control within the system. And it does that primarily through personnel. So it's actually managed to get lots of Chinese personnel very high up in various agencies, UN agencies and institutions, global institutions. So in a sense, it's not that it's writing a new world order from scratch. It's trying to take over the places of the existing one that the US has willfully abandoned.
And at the same time, they're colonizing, I suppose, the narrative, the historic narrative. This is also a celebration of how China and Russia won the Second World War. They're sort of ceding legitimacy to everything they do by talking about everybody else as somehow enabling Nazis. A lot of their comments were about the remilitarization of Japan and Europe, as if Europe is the one behaving badly. In that context, how does the West respond to what they're seeing? I mean, do you double down and remilitarize more, or should they be reaching out with diplomacy?
I don't think that Europe has much of a choice than to militarize because, we have been, with the invasion of Ukraine, badly exposed for the poverty of our military defenses in Europe. And that has seen everyone wake up and vastly increase their military budgets, although, of course, a lot of countries, almost the entirety of that increase will be probably in the form of assistance to Ukraine. So I think that given that we've got that hot war going on in Europe, there is no option. I think Japan is looking at the US and thinking, you're not a reliable ally to us either. So we probably have to be ready too. But I mean, of course, it's grossly hypocritical, this talk. Now, obviously, because we see history from a Western point of view, we do tend to play down the vast numbers of people who died, Chinese and Russian people who died in the Second World War, fighting the same enemies that we were. But again, it's Russia's aggression that started what is happening in Ukraine. So try and paint it as European aggression is that may wash to a Russian or a Chinese audience, but it's not going to wash amongst very many in the West.
And standing back, are we basically seeing President Trump in his second term actually accelerating the process of leading us to a multipolar world where America is no longer not only the policeman, but just the central power that rules over everyone else?
I think yes and no, because he is so unpredictable. And, there is this element that we went into this term thinking that he was going to be isolationist and pull America out of everything. And in fact, he's doing all sorts of strange things, including almost an imperial presidency in saying that he wants to occupy Panama, Canada, and Greenland. And, we now have this extraordinary story of last week about some sort of US intelligence operatives in Greenland trying to foment a separatist and pro-American movement there. We also see, astonishing interference in the affairs of other countries. So, for example, what Donald Trump is doing about the fact that his old chum Bolsonaro is being prosecuted in Brazil for doing what he did after he lost the 2020 election and trying to have the electoral process overthrown by his supporters. And he's sanctioned the Brazilian leader Lula over that and has sanctioned the Brazilian court and has taken all sorts of aggressive moves towards that country, simply apparently to shield someone, an old populist ally who's well out of power and is not going to get back there. So it's such a peculiar bunch of impulses and reactions to different countries. I mean, who would have thought this whole rift with India was unforeseen? None of this is in a systematic fashion that really you could put into a greater strategy, or it just seems to be very, very ad hoc. And so there's no vision behind this. It's just what's happening.
And Catherine, how worried should we be about this? I mean, you have gatherings, regional gatherings all the time. You have different structures, perhaps in Asia for sort of economic cooperation. Why is this so alarming? Why is the build-up of these blocs worrying people?
I think it's partly to do with the fear that the Western alliance isn't as strong as these blocs may become. So I think that that's really where it starts, is so you have simultaneously these rogue actors, as we see them, getting closer together, sounding more like the sort of global elite, the leaders, forming these powerful alliances at a time when we aren't sure if the alliances between Western democracies are sound. And also, it can be easier for places that are not democracies to take these sudden decisions and to do aggressive things like attack another country. Democracies tend to flounder on the altar of public opinion when they do stuff like that. So I would say that it's both those things, both the tightening of those alliances and the mirror that it puts up to our own.
That was the World Affairs editor for The Times, Catherine Philp, and you also heard earlier from Richard Spencer, our China correspondent. There'll be more coverage of all the latest from China, including that parade, at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.